In the spring of 1943, the fate of North Africa hung in the balance. For 6 long months, Allied and Axis forces had been locked in a brutal struggle across the unforgiving mountains and plains of Tunisia. After the initial Allied landings of Operation Torch, the Germans had rushed veteran troops across the Mediterranean, turning what should have been a quick campaign into a bloody, grinding war of attrition. The Axis forces, now dug into a formidable defensive perimeter protecting the key ports of Tunis and Bizerta, were cornered with their backs to the sea. But they were far from beaten. Commanded by the capable General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa was composed of some of the most battle-hardened units in the Axis arsenal, including remnants of the legendary Afrika Korps and the elite Hermann Göring division. They believed they could hold out indefinitely, perhaps even long enough for Hitler to send a miracle weapon or for the Allies to lose their nerve. They were dug in, confident, and ready for the final Allied assault. What they didn't know was that they were not just waiting for a battle. They were waiting for a trap. The Allied High Command, under the overall direction of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had devised a plan of such cunning and strategic deception that it would not only break the Axis lines but would encircle and annihilate their entire army group. This is the hidden story of Operation Vulcan and Operation Strike, the Allied mousetrap that caught over 250,000 Axis soldiers and sealed the fate of North Africa. It was a battle won not just with overwhelming force, but with a brilliant lie that the Germans swallowed whole. The situation for the Allies in early April 1943 was challenging. The mountainous terrain of northern Tunisia was a defender's paradise, crisscrossed with steep hills, narrow valleys, and rocky ridges that the Germans had turned into a fortress. A direct frontal assault would be incredibly costly. The Allied force was a complex mix of British, American, and French units, each with different equipment, doctrines, and levels of experience. The overall ground commander, the British General Harold Alexander of the 18th Army Group, had to orchestrate this multinational force into a single cohesive hammer blow. His main forces consisted of the British First Army under the gruff and cautious General Kenneth Anderson, the British Eighth Army under the famous General Bernard Montgomery advancing from the south, and the American II Corps, now under the aggressive command of General Omar Bradley, with George S. Patton having been moved on to plan the invasion of Sicily. The initial Allied plan, codenamed Operation Vulcan, was a broad front assault. The British Eighth Army would attack the formidable Enfidaville line in the south, the French 19 Corps would push in the center, and the British First Army, including the American II Corps, would strike in the north towards Bizerta and Tunis. The plan was sound but conventional. It risked becoming another slow, grinding battle with heavy casualties. But then, a new, more audacious idea emerged. The key to Tunis lay through the Majerta River Valley, a relatively flat corridor that led directly to the city. However, this was the most heavily defended part of the entire Axis line. The Germans knew it was the most logical path of attack and had concentrated their best units and anti-tank guns there. A direct assault would be suicidal. This is where the deception began. The Allied commanders decided to use the Germans' own expectations against them. They would make the Germans believe the main attack was coming somewhere else, forcing them to move their precious reserves away from the real target. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. General Anderson's First Army would launch a powerful but limited attack in the south of their sector, towards the hills around Mejez El Bab. This attack, carried out by the British V Corps, would be fierce and would use a significant number of tanks. It was designed to look exactly like the main effort. The Germans, seeing a massive British assault developing, would have no choice but to rush their elite mobile reserves, particularly the powerful panzers of the 10th Panzer Division and the Hermann Göring Division, south to counter this threat. Once those reserves were fully committed and locked in battle far away from the Majerta Valley, the real attack would begin. This was the bait. The trap itself was Operation Strike. While the Germans were distracted, the British 9 Corps, under the command of the aggressive General John Crocker, would be secretly moved into position. This corps, packed with 2 armored divisions and an infantry division, was the Sledgehammer. They would be concentrated on a very narrow front in the Majerta Valley. Their objective was to smash through the now weakened German lines in a single lightning-fast armored thrust, bypass the remaining strongpoints, and race the 25 miles to Tunis. It was a high-risk, high-reward plan. If the deception failed, 9 Corps would be attacking the strongest part of the German line and would likely be annihilated. But if it worked, the entire Axis army group would be caught with its pants down, its mobile reserves out of position and unable to react in time. The mouse trap would be sprung. The execution of the plan began in late April. The British V Corps launched their preliminary attacks, codenamed Operation Peter and Operation Rob Roy. The fighting was brutal. The Germans had turned the hills, known as Long Stop Hill and Jebel Bu Aukaz, into formidable fortresses. The British infantry, including the famous Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, fought desperate battles for every inch of ground. The fighting was so intense, the German command was completely convinced this was the main Allied effort. As the Allies had hoped, General von Arnim reacted exactly as they predicted. He ordered his most powerful mobile reserve, the Hermann Göring Division, to move south and counterattack the British V Corps. The bait had been taken. While the Germans were focused on this bloody struggle in the south, a massive and secret logistical ballet was taking place. The American II Corps, which had been holding the northern part of the line, was quietly relieved by French units. Under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, the entire Corps, with its thousands of vehicles and men, marched over 40 miles across the rear of the British First Army to take up a new position on the far northern flank, preparing for a push on Bizerta. This incredible feat of logistics completely surprised the German command, who had no idea an entire American corps had repositioned itself. More importantly, this move cleared the way for the real striking force. The British 9 Corps, with its hundreds of Sherman and Churchill tanks, moved into its secret assembly areas behind the Majerta Valley front. The concentration of armor was immense, over 400 tanks on a front just a few thousand yards wide. Allied air power played a crucial role, flying thousands of sorties to blind German reconnaissance and disrupt any attempts to move their reserves back north. For days, Allied fighter bombers, Spitfires, and P-40s owned the skies, strafing and bombing anything that moved on the roads behind the German lines. The trap was set. On the morning of May 6, 1943, Operation Strike began. At 3 a.m., over 600 Allied guns opened fire in one of the most concentrated artillery barrages of the entire war. For hours, a storm of high-explosive shells rained down on the German positions in the Majerta Valley. The German defenders, mostly from the 334th Infantry Division, were stunned by the ferocity of the bombardment. They were good soldiers, but they were without their critical panzer support, which was still stuck in battle miles to the south. As the barrage lifted, the British tanks surged forward. The 4th British Infantry Division and the 6th and 7th Armored Divisions advanced behind a creeping wall of their own artillery fire. Churchill tanks, with their thick armor, lumbered forward, shrugging off German anti-tank fire and crushing machine gun nests under their tracks. Behind them came the faster, more numerous Shermans, exploiting the gaps and fanning out into the German rear. The German line, stripped of its reserves, simply disintegrated. The defenders fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. By midday, the British tanks had smashed through the entire German defensive system and were pouring out onto the open plains leading to Tunis. The German command was in a state of shock and disbelief. Reports flooded in of a massive Allied armored breakthrough, but their best reserves were out of position, low on fuel, and being relentlessly pounded by Allied aircraft. It was too late. The mousetrap had snapped shut. A German officer captured during the breakthrough described the scene. "It was not a battle," he said. "It was an avalanche. We heard the roar of the guns, and then the tanks were upon us. They were everywhere. We had nothing to stop them." The British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, raced towards Tunis. They encountered sporadic resistance, but the main German army was now in a state of collapse. On the afternoon of May 7th, less than 36 hours after the attack began, the lead elements of the 11th Hussars and the Derbyshire Yeomanry rolled into the city of Tunis. The local population, both French and Arab, poured into the streets to welcome them as liberators. At the same time, the repositioned American II Corps, in a perfectly coordinated assault, smashed through the German lines in the north and captured the vital port city of Bizerta. The two main objectives of the campaign had fallen in a single stunning blow. The fall of Tunis and Bizerta sealed the fate of Panzer Army Africa. With their main ports captured and the British Eighth Army pushing from the south, the remaining Axis forces were squeezed into the Cape Bon Peninsula, their backs literally against the sea. Their situation was completely hopeless. Hitler, in a fit of delusional rage reminiscent of Stalingrad, had forbidden any thought of evacuation. He ordered the army to fight to the last man, effectively sacrificing over 250,000 of his best soldiers. For the German and Italian troops, there was nothing left to do but surrender. The scenes that followed were surreal. Starting on May 9th, Axis units began surrendering en masse. Entire divisions laid down their arms. The roads were clogged with endless columns of defeated German and Italian soldiers marching into captivity. The scale of the collapse was staggering. General von Arnim himself was captured on May 12th. The next day, the last organized Axis resistance in Africa ceased. In total, the Allies took over 275,000 prisoners of war. It was a strategic catastrophe for the Axis that rivaled the disaster at Stalingrad just a few months earlier, earning it the nickname Tunisgrad. The Allies had captured an entire army group, including some of the most experienced and elite units in the German military. The loss of these veteran soldiers was a blow from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover. The Allied victory in Tunisia was total. It had been achieved through a combination of overwhelming material superiority and, crucially, through brilliant strategic deception. The mousetrap plan had worked perfectly. By making the Germans look one way, the Allies were able to deliver the decisive blow from another. It was a masterclass in the art of war, proving that even against a formidable and dug-in enemy, a well-planned deception could be more powerful than a head-on assault. The victory cleared the last Axis forces from the continent of Africa, secured the southern flank of Europe, and opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping. It was the essential stepping stone for the upcoming invasions of Sicily and Italy. For the soldiers involved, it was a moment of profound significance. For the Americans, it was the ultimate redemption for the humiliation of Kasserine Pass. They had proven they could not only fight but could win against the best the German army had to offer. For the British, it was the culmination of a long, hard-fought campaign that had begun years earlier in the deserts of Egypt. And for the Germans and Italians who marched into the Pau cages, it was the bitter end of their African dream. They had been outfought, outmaneuvered, and ultimately outthought. The story of the Tunisian victory and the brilliant mousetrap that sealed it is a powerful reminder that in warfare, the most effective weapon is often not a tank or a gun, but an idea. It's a hidden front where battles are won in the minds of commanders long before the first shot is ever fired. And in the spring of 1943, the Allies proved they had mastered it, closing the book on the war in Africa and setting the stage for the final liberation of Europe.